The Black Sea Fleet dispute took place between Russia and Ukraine following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The dispute revolved around the ownership of the former Soviet Black Sea Fleet, basing rights in Sevastopol, the home base of the fleet, and sovereignty over Crimea. The dispute began in 1992 and involved a series of negotiations and maritime incidents before being finally settled in 1997 through the Partition Treaty on the Status and Conditions of the Black Sea Fleet. In 1991, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine and Russia emerged as sovereign nations. The dissolution kicked off the process of dividing former Soviet assets between the newly established republics. Along with the ownership of nuclear weapons located in Ukraine, the ownership of the Black Sea Fleet emerged as one of the most contentious issues. Moreover, with the fleet's home base being located in Sevastopol, the question of who would retain the basing rights there also remained open. Finally, the issue of sovereignty over the entire Crimean Peninsula also surfaced, with the peninsula having a 78% ethnic Russian population. Having emerged as an independent nation, the dispute over Black Sea Fleet ownership was more of an issue of strengthening this newly acquired sovereignty for Ukraine rather than that of acquiring an entirely new fleet, as Ukraine could not afford its maintenance costs. More principal issues than ownership of the vessels were the basing rights in Sevastopol and sovereignty over Crimea, which Ukraine sought to maintain. For Russia, the principal issue was to acquire the ships and the basing rights, which were preferred to be on the sovereign territory of Russia. It was of symbolic importance for Russia in order to project its power on its southern flank in relation to Turkey, the Caucasus, and the future Caspian oil flows. Russia sought to establish a powerful presence in the region. The Black Sea Fleet was established in 1783 by the Russian Empress Catherine the Great. The estimates of the number of ships in the Black Sea Fleet varied, with different estimates ranging from 300 to 635. The Black Sea Fleet, according to the think tank International Institute for Strategic Studies, numbered some 45 surface warships, 28 submarines, and 300 other vessels, plus 151 combat fixed-wing aircraft and 85 helicopters. The ships have been described as prestigious but rotting. The fleet had 70,000 sailors, of whom 30% were Ukrainians. The Russian-led Commonwealth of Independent States was founded by the ex-Soviet republics, including Ukraine and Russia, in place of the Soviet Union in December 1991. On 30 December, agreements were signed in Minsk allowing each republic to have its own army while placing the strategic forces under the command of the unified armed forces of the CIS. As Ukraine moved closer to creating its own military, it led to the issue of the ownership of the Black Sea Fleet surfacing in the relations between the two countries. The dispute involved protracted negotiations over the fleet, with there being different stages in the negotiations. The dispute over the Black Sea Fleet ships took precedence during an early stage. The central point during the very beginning of the talks was whether the fleet would be divided at all or placed under joint CIS command. After reaching an agreement on splitting the fleet, the issue of the allocation of bases surfaced and became the most contentious one, which led to an even wider dispute over the sovereignty of Crimea. The issue of basing rights dominated the negotiations in 1993-1997. During the first 2 years after the Soviet dissolution, the issue was discussed concurrently with the Ukrainian nuclear arsenal issue, with the two negotiations affecting each other, although later it was decided that a consensus would never be achieved if one issue continued to influence the other one. The discussions over the ownership of the Black Sea Fleet created tensions not only between Russia and Ukraine, but within these states themselves, particularly between executives, legislatures, and strong interest groups, such as the armed forces, which often voiced differing opinions. The arguments regarding the ownership of the Black Sea Fleet often revolved around different and competing interpretations of the laws and international treaties. Ukraine based its claim of ownership on territoriality. On 10 September 1991, the Ukrainian Supreme Soviet passed a law that nationalized Soviet property and financial assets on Ukraine's territory, and another law, passed in December 1991, subordinated all military formations on Ukrainian territory to Ukraine. The Ukrinform issued a statement in April 1992, saying, Ukraine's position at the negotiations on the issue of the Black Sea Fleet will be built on the right of every state to inherit the property located on its territory. The military structures of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, backed by the Russian government, voiced their own claim that the fleet was the property of the CIS based on the Minsk Agreement. They alluded to the fleet's claimed classification as a strategic force, arguing that the fleet was part of the strategic forces due to half of its ships being capable of carrying strategic nuclear weapons. They said that because of this, the fleet should be placed under the joint CIS command according to the Minsk Agreement. The claim was also supported by Black Sea Fleet Commander Vladimir Kasatonov, who also argued against any possible division of the fleet between the countries, saying, dismembering the fleet would be like dismembering living flesh. However, Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk rejected these claims, arguing that they were based on an overly broad interpretation of what constituted strategic forces. Kravchuk asserted that after removing strategic nuclear weapons from the fleet's nuclear-capable ships, these ships and the fleet as a whole could not be considered as strategic anymore, and that the principle of territoriality would require the fleet's transfer to Ukraine. Ukraine voiced an immediate claim on all the non-strategic ships, and also on the rest after removing and destroying the strategic nuclear weapons from them. Kasatonov further argued against Ukrainian ownership by telling the Ukrainian officials, "You cannot privatize the armed forces in history." He claimed that the fleet as a whole had a strategic significance due to its ability to project power in the Mediterranean Sea, as it was challenging the United States Sixth Fleet. Thus, in addition to the fleet including nuclear-capable vessels, its strategic value was also ascribed to it projecting power through the Mediterranean Sea and challenging the United States Sixth Fleet and the Turkish Navy. View that the fleet was CIS property was initially shared by Russian President Boris Yeltsin and Defense Minister Pavel Grashev, and was also supported by Crimean President Yuri Meshkov in 1994, who said that the issue of the Black Sea Fleet ownership should be resolved based on the interests of all CIS states, along with the wishes of the Crimean population and authorities. Commander of the CIS Armed Forces, Yevgeny Shapashnikov claimed that the fleet should be divided not just between Russia and Ukraine, but between all CIS member states. Most active supporters of the CIS ownership were the CIS Command and the Black Sea Fleet's officers. Felix Gromov, first deputy commander of the fleet, argued that it should be under CIS Command so it could maintain the ability to coordinate with the Baltic and Northern fleets. Ukraine opposed the CIS ownership by saying that the Navy cannot be interstate and that it needs to be answerable to a particular state, which it claimed would be Russia in the case of CIS ownership. Besides CIS ownership, Russia additionally also claimed its own ownership right over the Black Sea Fleet. Russia's claim was based on it being the successor to the USSR and its legal heir. Russian President Boris Yeltsin, while initially claiming that the entire fleet was Russian in early January 1992, stepped back from this position by mid-January and claimed CIS ownership. In April, while still reiterating his claim of CIS command over the Black Sea Fleet, Yeltsin also moved to establish Russia's own Navy, Army, and Air Force, saying that the idea of unified CIS armed forces failed to materialize. After it was decided to divide the fleet between Ukraine and Russia and to place it under their temporary interstate joint command by August 1992, the line of argument supporting CIS ownership lost its relevance, and Russia's main claim began to revolve around its own right to ownership over the fleet. Both Russia and Ukraine often based their claims on the fleet on financial arguments. In April 1994, the Ukrainian ambassador to Moscow said that Ukraine could claim 16% of the whole Soviet Navy, which was more than the Black Sea Fleet, based on its assumption of 16.4% of the USSR's debt. Anton Butiko, the foreign affairs advisor to the Ukrainian president, said that Ukraine could claim 20 to 25% based on its supposed contribution to the building and maintaining of the Soviet Navy. Additionally, both sides used the claimed funding of the fleet during the dispute itself to justify their ownership claims over the BSF. As such, Boris Yeltsin's decree in April 1992, asserting Russian ownership of the fleet, cited the fact that the Black Sea Fleet's activities were financed from the budget of the Russian Federation as one of its justifications. At the same time, both sides made statements connecting the Black Sea Fleet to their national identities, invoking historical traditions. Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk linked the Black Sea Fleet to the Cossack exploration of the Black Sea while speaking on the Zaporozhian Cossacks and their fleet's activities in the Black Sea. On the other hand, Russian officer Vladimir Chernovin said that the Black Sea Fleet has always been Russian, as we know from history, while Kasatonov linked its creation to the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. The issue of the ownership of the Black Sea Fleet was raised first in January 1992, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Viktor Antonov, Ukrainian Minister of State for Defense Affairs, and Konstantin Morzov, Defense Minister of Ukraine, stated in January 1992 that the Black Sea Fleet belonged to Ukraine and would remain so. As Ukraine moved to create its own military after the Minsk Agreement, Ukraine announced its control over Soviet army and naval units on its territory, and on 4 January ordered servicemen to swear allegiance to Ukraine or return to their homelands. In response, thousands demonstrated in Sevastopol against Ukraine, taking over military bases and the Black Sea Fleet. President of Russia Boris Yeltsin voiced his opposition to Ukraine's control of the Black Sea Fleet and called servicemen not to swear the oath. On 9 January, Yeltsin said, "The Black Sea Fleet was, is, and will remain Russia's." Black Sea Fleet Commander Admiral Vladimir Kasatonov spoke in favor of placing the fleet under CIS command, which was backed by the Russian government. As the Minsk Agreement, co-signed by Ukraine and Russia, required the strategic forces to be placed under CIS command, Ukrainian and Russian officials argued over to what extent the definition of strategic forces applied to the Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine said that it would transfer to the CIS command only heavy surface ships and nuclear-carrying submarines. Kasatonov, on the other hand, dismissed the idea of splitting the fleet into strategic and non-strategic elements as absurd, and argued that the entire fleet should be transferred to the CIS command. Russia was willing to compromise only by giving some non-strategic light ships, including coastal patrol boats as well as anti-submarine aircraft, to Ukraine, considering all the rest of the ships as strategic ones to be given to the CIS. At the same time, the issue of Crimea also flared up, with the Black Sea Fleet admirals calling on Russia to retake Crimea and describing its transfer to Ukraine in 1954 as illegal in a letter to Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, according to Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the official paper of the Russian parliament. On 12 January, the Russian and Ukrainian negotiators met in Kiev and pledged to avoid unilateral actions to diffuse tensions. A contest for the loyalties ensued, with some sailors and officers swearing loyalty to Ukraine, while others swore loyalty to the CIS, which was administered by Kasatonov. The situation eventually developed into a stalemate, with no progress being achieved at the CIS summit in March 1992. As the negotiations stalled on 7 April, Kravchuk decreed the beginning of the formation of organs to manage Ukraine's own navy on the basis of the Black Sea Fleet. Kravchuk also reaffirmed Ukraine's commitment to joint Commonwealth operating control over nuclear weapons. Ukraine claimed that it had the right to inherit a share of the former Soviet Navy based on its substantial contribution to the building of the Baltic, Northern Pacific and Black Sea fleets of the former Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin countered by adopting his own decree placing the Black Sea Fleet under Russia's jurisdiction and ordering its ships to raise the St. Andrew's flag, an old symbol of the Russian Navy. Amid rumors that Ukrainian militias would take over Black Sea Fleet installations, the Russian fleet commanders ordered the military police, backed by APCs, to patrol bases in Sevastopol. Dmytro Pavlichko, the head of the Ukrainian Parliamentary Commission on Foreign Affairs, stated that, in formal terms, Yeltsin's decree put Ukraine in a state of war with Russia. However, further tensions were averted as a result of 2 telephone calls between Kravchuk and Yeltsin, with both of them agreeing to suspend their decrees and to set up a commission for the purpose of dividing the fleet. The negotiations began in Odessa on 29 April 1992. At the table, the Russian delegation emphasized that the issue of the Black Sea Fleet should be viewed primarily through the lens of Black Sea Fleet personnel and their rights. A memorandum was signed to ward off unilateral actions aggravating tensions, and a joint commission was established after the negotiations. Russian President Boris Yeltsin and Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk held a Russian-Ukrainian summit in Dagamys on 23 June, where they partially resolved their dispute over the Black Sea Fleet, agreeing on sharing the bases in Crimea and on the division of the Black Sea Fleet, while postponing talks on how to apportion the naval assets in the fleet. The 18-point Dagamys agreement also included agreements on the introduction of the hryvnia as Ukraine's new currency in exchange for shifting to world prices in bilateral Russian-Ukrainian trade. Sides pledged to work in concert to resolve violent conflicts in the region and agreed on a joint Russian-Ukrainian conference on the Transnistria conflict. Sides failed to reach an agreement on the control of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine signed a general agreement on friendly ties and agreed to start negotiations on a new political treaty to confirm this relationship. However, the tensions flared up soon on 22 July 1992, when the Black Sea Fleet Coast Guard frigate armed with torpedoes, 2 cannons, and depth charges raised the Ukrainian flag and headed from a training exercise in Donoslav to Odessa without permission. Sailors who had already taken an oath of allegiance to Ukraine claimed oppression and humiliation by senior Russian officers. The Black Sea Fleet sent guided missile cruisers, hydrofoil, 3 other ships, and a plane to pursue the frigate. Russian Vice President Alexander Rutskoy called the incident a mutiny, although Ukraine said that they would keep the ship and would not bring charges against sailors, which led to the Black Sea Fleet accusing Ukraine of piracy. During an emergency meeting between Russian and Ukrainian officials, they agreed to set up a commission to prevent such incidents in the future. The incident derailed the negotiations, and to get them back on track, several meetings were held in Sevastopol, during which Ukraine rejected Russia's proposals for an 80-20 or a 60-40 division of the ships. On 3 August 1992, Kravchuk and Yeltsin signed an agreement near Yalta to place the Black Sea Fleet under joint Russo-Ukrainian command for 3 years before its division, removing it from CIS command. They agreed to the joint appointment of commanders of the fleet and to split the fleet into separate Russian and Ukrainian fleets in 1995. They also agreed on joint funding of the fleet. The joint fleet would use the Sevastopol base as its headquarters. The sides did not agree on the specifics of how the fleet would be divided.